right, the last thing that we're going to talk about is the dynamics of the ecosystem. So like we've said before, an ecosystem is composed of the interactions between populations as well as their physical environments. So the abiotic components of an ecosystem are going to be the non-living things like water, atmosphere, water, soil, light. Then the living components are going to be things like, can be categorized according to their food sources, such as autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotrophs are also known as producers. They require only inorganic nutrients and an outside energy source to produce organic nutrients for their own use and for all of the members of the community. This is going to include photosynthetic organisms, land, plants, algae, photoautotrophs. Some autotrophs are chemoautotrophs, meaning that they can obtain energy by oxidizing inorganic compounds and harvest the energy to synthesize organic compounds. So we're going to start off, so those are autotrophs. Here is a great example of our autotrophs, things like algae or plants. These are going to be our photosynthesizers, primarily responsible for turning inorganic materials into organic materials using solar energy. We are also going to have heterotrophs. Heterotrophs need pre-formed organic nutrients that they can use as an energy source. And there are going to be a lot of different heterotrophs, but heterotrophs are also known as consumers. They have to consume the food generated by a producer. So these are going to be things like herbivores. Herbivores feed on plants and algae. Carnivores feed on other animals. Omnivores are animals that can feed on both plants and animals. And then there are detrivores. Detrivores are going to feed on decomposing organic matter. So they feed on things that are already dead. And break that down further into a form known as detritus. Decomposers can then break down that detritus. They're going to release those inorganic substances, which are then going to be taken up by plants. So we're going to talk through some of these. Here are our herbivores. Here's an example of our herbivores. Things like insects, caterpillars, rabbits. They are going to eat our plants. Carnivores are then going to eat our herbivores. Here we have, and carnivores can come on multiple levels. Here we have a snake that's eating a rabbit. So this rabbit is our initial herbivore. The snake eats the rabbit, and then the hawk can eat the snake. So there are carnivores that eat other carnivores. And then we have our decomposers. Our decomposers are going to break down that dead organic matter and release it or return it into inorganic materials that can then be taken up by our plants and used all over again. So here's just sort of the dynamics of that ecosystem. As we've mentioned before, energy sort of flows in one direction. All energy starts off as solar energy, and then it's going to be passed from one trophic level to the next, ultimately being released into the environment in the form of heat. So that's going to be our energy flow. This begins when the producers absorb that solar energy. They're going to make organic nutrients via photosynthesis, and they're going to give off some of that solar energy in the form of heat. Those organic nutrients are used by themselves. Only a portion of that organic nutrients made by the producers is passed on to the consumers. The vast majority of the energy is going to be released into the environment in the form of heat. Organic nutrients are going to be used by the consumers who eat the producers. And only a small percentage of the nutrients consumed by the lower level consumers is available to the higher level consumers or the carnivores. Energy is ultimately being lost at every stage. So eating a plant is going to have of the same biomass as a rabbit. Is going to have significantly more energy because of all of the heat or all of the energy that is lost, dissipated into the environment in the form of heat between the transition from the producer to the consumer level. So energy is going to flow through the ecosystem via photosynthesis. Only a portion of those organic nutrients made by the producers are passed on to consumers. Organisms use those organic molecules to fuel their own metabolism, growth, and reproduction. Additional energy is ultimately going to be lost through the excretion, defecation, and organisms that die without being consumed. So here's another way that we can look at sort of energy flow. We can look at energy flow through a food web. This is going to represent the interconnecting paths of energy flow within an ecosystem. It's also going to describe the different trophic levels or the different feeding relationships between the organisms here. So for example, we have leaves. Leaves can be eaten by mice. Mice can also eat nuts. Mice are also going to be potentially eating our beetles, or so those are all things that can be consumed by our mice. Our rabbits eat the leaves, and the foxes eat the rabbits. Foxes can also eat chipmunks. Chipmunks can also be eaten by the snakes, but the chipmunks also eat the nuts. Those nuts, those same nuts that are eaten by the mice, can also feed the chipmunks. The chipmunks can feed the hawks, feed the owls, feed the foxes, feed the snake. That chipmunk can also eat the carnivorous beetles. So what we see here is just a constant interaction. Our primary producers, or our producers, are going to be those that aren't feeding on anybody. They're producing their own food. Our primary consumers are going to be the ones that are eating our producers. So we have our leaf-eating insects, we have our deer, we have our rabbits, we have our mice. Those are all primary consumers. Then we have the organisms that eat our primary consumers. Our birds that eat the leaf-eating insects, or our hawks that eat the chipmunks, or our owls that eat the chipmunks. We have so those are all the different relationships between the various organisms found in this particular community. So when we're talking about the dynamics of an ecosystem, we're often going to be talking about trophic levels. The trophic levels are going to be a level of nutrients within a food web or within a food chain, and it's going to be composed of all the organisms that feed at that same level in a food chain. So, for example, the leaves are going to be that first initial trophic level. Those are going to be our producers. The herbivores that consume the leaves or consume the plants are going to be our primary consumers, our second trophic level. And the carnivores that eat our herbivores are going to be our secondary consumers in our secondary trophic level. So here are our various trophic levels. Our first trophic level is going to be our producers, also known as our autotrophs. Our second level will be the primary consumers. These are the herbivores or the omnivores that eat the producers. So these are the plant-eating animals. Next, we have our third trophic level, the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Every level eats the level before it. So the secondary consumers will be our carnivores that eat the herbivores that eat the producers. And our tertiary consumers are going to be carnivores that eat secondary consumers. In other words, carnivores that eat other carnivores. So a great example, like we mentioned earlier, would be a hawk. Hawks are tertiary consumers that eat the snakes, which are secondary consumers that eat the rabbits, which are primary consumers that eat the leaves, which are producers. This slide right here is a fantastic slide that you should review. You may be given a picture of a food web and asked to label the various organisms per their trophic level. I think there's also a question on your study guide that asks you to describe the various trophic levels and place the organisms like herbivores, omnivores, autotrophs, carnivores, place them on the various trophic levels. So make sure you review the slide and ask me if you have any questions about the different trophic levels. The next thing, or the last thing I kind of want to mention, is ecological pyramids. What we'd like to mention here is that only about 10% of the energy of one trophic level is actually going to be available to the next trophic level. This explains why there are so very few top carnivores in a given environment. So if you look in your backyard, you may see, for example, my backyard can support probably, 3 rabbits. Based on the sheer amount of grass and clover that is found there. There's a lot of grass, there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of clover, there's a lot of weeds, but we can really only support about 3 rabbits in that area, and we can probably only support about 1 hawk in the whole neighborhood. And that's because there's so much energy lost at each stage. If a hawk could eat grass, we would see a lot more hawks. But since they're only going to eat the rabbits, and the rabbits can't make their own food, if they could make their own food, we'd have a lot more rabbits. But rabbits have to eat their food, so they have to rely on the grass to produce that food, that energy for them. Whoops. So our autotrophs, here's going to be our autotrophic level. Let's just say that we have about 800 9 grams per meter square. That's going to be the cubic density or the biomass. We're going to find that at the next level, we're only going to see about 37. The next level will be 11. At the top carnivore level, maybe only 1.5. In terms of our biomass, so the amount of species, physical dry mass of a species that can be supported in that particular area. So in those ecological pyramids, these are going to be pyramids of biomass. Biomass is the number of organisms times the dry weight of the organic matter within one organism. So the biomass of producers is expected to exceed the herbivores, which should exceed that of the carnivores because so much energy is lost from one trophic level to the next. Most of your energy, remember when we talked way on back when we talked about energy transformations and we talked about how we can transition energy from solar energy to chemical energy and how most of that energy is going to be lost or given off to the environment in the form of heat. This is why. So much energy is lost in the form of heat, which means that we're going to have progressively smaller levels as we increase in our trophic feeding level. All right, so as we've mentioned, energy flows through an ecosystem. Energy sort of decreases at each level. Usable energy decreases at each level because the bulk of energy is going to be lost in the form of heat. Chemicals, on the other hand, do not get lost. Chemicals cycle throughout an ecosystem. So chemical cycling is the pathways by which chemicals circulate through an ecosystem, and it's going to involve both living and non-living components. These are known as the biogeochemical cycles. They're going to be things like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So here's sort of what that cycle looks like. So chemical cycling can involve several different components, things like a reservoir. A reservoir is going to be a source that's normally unavailable to producers. So a great example would be the carbon that's present in the calcium carbonate shells on the ocean bottom. There's tons and tons and tons of calcium out there, but it's locked away in the shells and it's not something the plants can really access. An exchange pool is the source from which organisms generally take chemicals, things like the atmosphere or the soil. The biotic community that's going to be involved in this process is going to be where the chemicals remain in the food chains. A lot of times they'll never even enter the pool. Many times they'll never even go as far as the reservoir. And human activities result in pollution because they can upset the normal balance of nutrients. And we're going to go through many examples of how these chemicals cycle. So starting with water. Water is very important. So water is our hydrologic cycle. What we have here is a diagram showing how water moves throughout the ecosystem. And what we'll see is that the vast majority of water is going to evaporate from the ocean and then precipitate right back into the ocean. The vast majority of water actually just cycles from the ocean back to the ocean. But what we can see is that there can be a net transport of water vapor by wind. In other words, wind can carry water vapor in the form of clouds over to land masses. Over land masses, we can actually see precipitation happen over land, where the rain falls, condenses in the cloud, falls over the land, gets taken up by the plants, and then through the process of transpiration from plants and evaporation from the soil, it gets taken back up into the atmosphere, precipitates over the land and falls down, and then cycles back up and falls down, cycles back up and falls down. Now what we will see is that there is a small amount of that water that's going to actually seep down into our groundwater, or aquifers, and from there it can actually move back out into the ocean, where it's going to, by and large, evaporate and precipitate out in the ocean. So there are things that we need to be aware of as humans. We have started things known as groundwater mining, where we're actually depleting our aquifers faster than they can be recharged, and we're doing this for irrigation purposes. Now, irrigation is a great thing. It's allowed for a lot of agricultural advances, but it is ultimately depleting our aquifers and groundwaters. Water is considered a renewable resource because fresh supply is always being produced, but it is still possible to run out of water if we deplete it too quickly without giving that time to replenish.